It is said that every city has a flip side. In this regard, it is difficult to deny that Glasgow also has one. Scotland's largest city, for a long time, was known as a city with the worst underworld, a place where politics or business is not the way of accruing power, but fear, violence, and crime. Only a handful of names have made the residents freeze in terror, like Kevin Gerbil Carroll. Violent and cruel in his ways, there are many stories about Kevin, who is considered a demigod of the violent Glasgow gang scene. His rise to the top was remarkable, but his demise was just as spectacular and brutal in image. This is the story of how one person lost his way into violence and commitment to one of the brutal gangland murders in Scotland. Born on August 24, 1980, in Glasgow's Stub Hill Hospital, Kevin Carroll's childhood did little to hint at the man he would become. As a boy, he endured relentless bullying at the hands of two boys, Stephen Lyons and his brother Edward Jr., names that would become hauntingly significant in the future. The Lyons family had deep roots in Glasgow's criminal landscape, but weren't the only ones vying for dominance in the city. There was another major player in town, the Daniel family. Kevin's fortunes change when he builds friendships with the sons of crime boss Jamie Daniel, Robert Daniel, and Francis Fraggle Green. The boys attended the same school, and soon, their bond pulled Kevin into the world of crime. Before long, he was swept up in the feud between the Lyons and Daniel families, a conflict that would shape his destiny and seal his fate. By his late teens, Kevin had become well acquainted with the police, racking up multiple arrests. But petty thefts were just the beginning. By his mid-20s, he had graduated to far more lucrative and violent endeavors. Kevin soon became the enforcer for the Daniel family, and his fearsome reputation grew rapidly. His weapon of choice, fear, his favorite tactic, a horrifying method known in the underworld as alien abduction. The technique was as brutal as it was traumatizing. Kevin and his crew would descend on their target's home, disguised as armed police officers. The victim would be blindfolded, whisked away to a desolate location, and subjected to unspeakable torture. The violence was so extreme that many victims either couldn't remember the events or were too terrified to speak about them. These assaults became known as alien abductions because the targets would reappear seemingly out of nowhere, broken and lost, with no memory of what had happened. The legend of Gerbil grew, and with it, the fear. Kevin Carroll wasn't just an enforcer. He was also heavily involved in Glasgow's drug trade. However, his reputation for ruthlessness extended beyond violence. He was known to double-cross even his associates. He'd sell drugs to dealers only to rob them of the same product hours later. One notorious incident saw Kevin ambushing a dealer who had just purchased 5 kilos of cocaine from him, reclaiming the drugs and keeping the cash. The underworld didn't forget these betrayals, and neither did his enemies. But Kevin's lust for power extended beyond drugs. He had his eyes on weapons, and when he heard about a stolen SA-80 rifle, the British Army's standard-issue firearm, he knew he had to have it. The rifle, complete with an infrared scope and tripod, was worth a fortune. Unfortunately for the Lyons family, they wanted it too. The Lyons had already put down a 4,000-pound deposit for the weapon, but that didn't stop Kevin. He kidnapped the soldier selling the gun, subjected him to his brutal methods, and forced him to hand over both the weapon and the Lyons deposit. The Lyons and Daniels crime families have been having disagreements and vendettas against each other for a long time, and possessions and politicization of people's desires and emotions made it worse. Each mobster dynasty was strong enough to conquer a slice of Glasgow's underworld and spend years expanding their criminal empires in the city. But, as it happened by the summer of 2001, the pressure reached its maximum limit, and so came hard drugs, violence, deception, and sometimes death. But a fierce war for the territory in the city. At the heart of this feud was a simple yet audacious act: the theft of a substantial stash of cocaine belonging to the Daniels family. The drugs had been stored in a house located in Milton, a territory fiercely controlled by the Lyons. In organized crime, where power is maintained through fear and control, the theft was not just a financial loss, but an affront, a direct challenge to the Daniels' authority. For Kevin Gerbil Carroll, the Daniels' infamous enforcer, this was a personal insult, and retaliation was not only necessary, but imminent. Kevin was more than willing to lead the charge against the Lyons. By this time, He had solidified his reputation as a ruthless enforcer who took pleasure in dealing out brutal punishment to those who dared to cross his path. His infamous alien abduction technique had already left countless victims traumatized and fearful, and he was ready to apply the same level of terror to the Lyons family. What followed was a series of escalating acts of violence between the two families, each side determined to assert dominance over the other. The once covert power struggle for control of Glasgow's drug trade erupted into an all-out war, with both sides engaging in increasingly audacious attacks that would shock the city. For the people of Glasgow, especially those living in the north of the city where the Lyons and Daniels held sway, life became a battleground. In any war, casualties are inevitable, and for Kevin Carroll, his role at the forefront of Daniels' retaliation efforts made him a prime target. The Lyons family, having felt the sting of Kevin's violent methods, knew that taking him out would deliver a significant blow to the Daniels' power. As the feud raged, the Lyons began orchestrating their revenge, plotting to rid themselves of their most dangerous enemy. The first attempt on Kevin's life came in 2003, a calculated ambush right outside his mother's home. The details of the attack remain murky, but Kevin was left injured, though not mortally. True to his reputation for survival, he managed to escape with his life. The failure to kill him did little to deter his enemies. If anything, it only increased his paranoia. Kevin was known for being vigilant and always looking for threats, but surviving this first attempt likely hardened him even further, making him more dangerous as he sought retribution. 3 years later, in 2006, Kevin found himself targeted by Lyon once again. This time, it was more than just a brazen drive-by shooting in broad daylight. Kevin and his colleague Ross Sherlock were walking in Bishop Briggs town when suddenly a car pulled up next to them. Shots rang out and chaos ensued. Kevin was shot in the stomach, but his vitality returned and he managed to stop the attack. The injuries were serious but not fatal, and Kevin lived to fight another day. For most people, 2 assassination attempts would have been a wake-up call, a reason to lie low or perhaps reconsider their life choices. But Kevin Carroll wasn't like most people. Each near-death experience only seemed to fuel his insatiable hunger for revenge. He grew more paranoid, always expecting another hit, but he became more unhinged and reckless in his quest to strike back at his enemies. He wasn't just looking to defend himself anymore. He wanted to send a message that no one could touch him. The violence between the Lyons and Daniels had reached a fever pitch. Still, the moment that truly pushed the feud into the realm of the unthinkable came as an act that shocked even the hardened members of Glasgow's criminal underworld. In an act of chilling cruelty, Kevin Carroll and his associates allegedly desecrated the grave of Gary Lyons, an 8-year-old boy who had died of leukemia in 1991. Gary was the son of Eddie Lyons Sr., the patriarch of the Lyons family. The desecration of a child's grave is an act so vile, so beyond the pale, that it left even the most battle-hardened gangsters reeling. The gravestone was vandalized an insult to the memory of a young boy who had no part in the violent world his family inhabited. The act was deeply personal and a statement of intent, a message to the Lyons family that the Daniels, especially Kevin Carroll, were willing to go to any lengths in this war, no matter how despicable. This was the final straw for the Lyons. They had already given blood through the loss of loved ones to this war, but what was done to Gary's grave screamed for revenge. Gary's family would have been celebrating his birthday this past week, and many of them were planning to be at the gravesite on Wednesday when the attack happened. The solemnity of fresh earth instead gave way to tearful fury, and in the open hole, they found nothing but anger and grief. What followed was an inevitable escalation in violence. The Lyons were out for blood. Kevin Carroll was their #1 target. The war between the two families was not just about territory or money. It had become deeply personal. Every attack, every act of violence was now driven by the need for revenge, and Kevin, with his volatile nature and penchant for cruelty, was at the center of it all. The violence moved outward and onto the streets, suctioning Glasgow into a whirligig of revenge, followed by another counter-revenge rinse cycle. Each time one side fired, the other would do so immediately after, and casualties began to spiral. The city turned into a war zone, and shootouts, stabbings, or arson attacks soon seemed to be part of day-to-day life on many streets. Kevin Carroll was at the heart of this bloody tit-for-tat warfare. As such, he was reported as a cornerman feared by the Daniel family for their drug empire and turf war. Source: ruthless and indifferent to any measure of consequences, he reveled in the mayhem that ensued between you two. Every violent act, every merciless retaliation, cost Kevin some of his enemies an enemy. The Lions were not the only ones who wanted him dead. By the time of the second assassination attempt in 2006, Kevin's paranoia was at an all-time high. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, always expecting the next attack. He wore bulletproof vests, traveled with armed associates, and was never far from a weapon. However, Kevin's reckless behavior only made him more vulnerable despite his efforts to protect himself. He was a marked man, and it was only a matter of time before his enemies caught up with him. Violence became a regular part of life for both families, and the feud claimed many lives. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in December 2006 when two Daniel enforcers stormed a car dealership owned by the Lyons family. They opened fire, killing 21-year-old Michael Lyons and wounding several others, including his cousin Stephen. Though the attackers were caught and sentenced to 35 years in prison, the Lyons were not finished. For 4 years, tensions simmered until they reached a breaking point on January 13, 2010. Kevin had arranged a meeting in the Asda car park in Roybroyston, Glasgow. Seated in the back of a black Audi, he was strangely relaxed. Unarmed and without security, he was uncharacteristically unprepared for what would happen. At 1:23 p.m., a Volkswagen Golf pulled into the car park, boxing in Kevin's Audi. Two men jumped out and immediately began firing into the car. Kevin's two associates seated in the front fled the scene unharmed. Kevin, trapped in the back seat, had no chance. He was hit by 5 bullets, one of which fatally struck him in the head. The attack lasted only 25 seconds, but by the time it was over, Kevin Carroll was dead. He was just 29 years old. The murder of Kevin Gerbil Carroll shocked Glasgow's underworld and the public alike. It was one of the most brazen gangland hits the city had ever seen, carried out in broad daylight in a busy supermarket car park. While the Lyons family was the obvious suspect, rumors soon began circulating that there was more to the story. Police arrested Ross Monahan, a known Lyons associate, but the trial collapsed in 2012. There was insufficient evidence to convict him, with the entire case hinging on a single particle of gunshot residue found on a jacket. The forensic evidence was deemed unreliable, and Monahan walked free. But there was more at play. It was later revealed that a disgraced police officer, Derek McCloy, had been feeding the Lyons confidential information about Kevin's whereabouts. McCloy, who was later convicted of drug offenses and breaching the Official Secrets Act, had been deeply embedded in the Lyons' criminal operations. His betrayal added yet another layer of intrigue to the case. Even with the Lyons family implicated, some in Glasgow's underworld believed that Kevin's death was orchestrated from within the Daniel family itself. Kevin had made plenty of enemies outside and within his circle. His violent tendencies, erratic behavior, and lack of loyalty had alienated many. He had even threatened Jamie Daniel, the head of the family, and had physically assaulted Jamie's daughter Kelly, Kevin's wife. Some speculated that the Daniel family had decided Kevin was too dangerous to keep around. The fact that his associates in the car fled without resistance and that Jamie's brother Francis was on the scene almost immediately after the hit fueled suspicions of an inside job. Had Kevin been set up by the very people he trusted? Kevin Carroll's death in 2010 marked the beginning of the end for his role in Glasgow's bloody gang wars, but it failed to bring the peace many had hoped for. His assassination, carried out in broad daylight while he sat in his car outside an Asda supermarket, was a shocking reminder that the feud between the Lyons and the Daniels was far from over. Even though Carroll had been a major player in the conflict, his death did little to stem the tide of violence that continued to engulf the city's criminal underworld. Both families remained locked in a bitter struggle for control over Glasgow's lucrative drug trade, their rivalry as fierce as ever. For those who knew Kevin, his violent death was no surprise. He had lived a life defined by brutality, chaos, and a relentless thirst for power, and in the end, it was violence that claimed him. His passing left a void in the Daniels family's operations, but it also left behind a legacy of fear and destruction. The families of those who had been caught in the crossfire were left to pick up the pieces, their lives forever scarred by the actions of men like Kevin Carroll, Communities that drugs and gang warfare had already ravaged continued to suffer, trapped in a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. Kevin Gerbil Carroll's story serves as a grim reminder of the harsh realities of life in Glasgow's underworld, a world where alliances are temporary, betrayal is commonplace, and violence is a constant presence. His death may have closed one chapter in the feud, but the book on Glasgow's gang wars remains open, with new names continuing to rise and fall in its bloody pages.